At 6:47 a.m. on June 14, 1944, 8 days after D-Day, Staff Sergeant James Callahan crouched behind a collapsed stone wall in the French village of Saint-Dôme, 400 yards from a German MG42 machine gun nest that had already killed 11 men. The gun sat atop an old water tower 40 feet high with a 270-degree field of fire across the only road Allied forces could use to push inland from Utah Beach. 3 previous assaults had failed. Artillery couldn't touch it, and the thick stone base absorbed everything. The position was too close to French civilian homes for heavy bombardment. In the next 6 hours, Callahan would use a childhood memory from his father's Iowa cornfield to do what doctrine, firepower, and 300 infantrymen couldn't: silence that gun. He wouldn't fire a single shot. The MG42 fired 1,200 rounds per minute. Soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the sound. Not the pop of American weapons, but a continuous tearing noise that shredded anything in its path with terrifying ease. The Germans had placed this gun perfectly. The tower stood at a crossroads. Every route to the next objective passed through its killing zone. The gunner saw the entire approach, and the thick stone walls meant small arms fire was useless against the position. Its sustained rate of fire meant even if you made it halfway across the field, you wouldn't make it the rest of the way. Captain Morris had watched his 3rd platoon try that morning. 23 men started the assault. 7 made it back alive. The MG42 cut them down in groups, 3 men here, 4 there, methodically sweeping left to right like someone mowing a lawn. Morris stood at the command post with his hands on his knees, staring at the dirt. "We can't go around it," he said quietly. "We can't shell it without leveling half the village. And we sure as hell can't go through it." He looked at Callahan. "You grew up on a farm, right? Any bright ideas?" Callahan stared at the water tower, 40 feet of stone and timber with a deadly gun on top. A blind spot nobody had thought to use lingered beneath it. His mind went back to Iowa, to a problem his father had solved with a ladder, some rope, and patience. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but you're not going to like it." Morris just waited. James Callahan grew up in Clarion, Iowa, population 2,800, where his family ran a 160-acre corn and hog farm. He worked that built calluses and patience. He fixed fences, hauled feed, pulled stumps. His father, Tom Callahan, was a natural problem solver, the kind of man who could examine broken machinery and see 3 ways to fix it with what was already in the barn. Jimmy inherited that same instinct. While other kids played baseball, Jimmy learned how pulley systems lifted twice your weight, how leverage beat strength, how sometimes the long way around was faster than the short way through. School wasn't his strength, but observation was. He watched his father work problems slowly, silently, until a solution appeared, obvious only in hindsight. That patience would later drive drill sergeants crazy. "Callahan, when I say move, I don't mean think first," Sergeant Davies would shout, but Callahan couldn't help it. His brain worked slow and thorough, best when facing problems nobody else could solve. He enlisted in December 1942, 6 months after his brother Patrick was killed at Midway. The Army placed him in the 101st Airborne, not because he asked, but because he scored high on mechanical aptitude and followed instructions well. He parachuted into Normandy on June 6, 1944, landed in a flooded field, lost his rifle, and spent 3 hours in waist-deep water finding his unit. By June 14th, he was exhausted, hungry, and running on stubbornness alone. The gun atop the tower had pinned down his company for 19 hours. Supplies were running low. Medics were treating wounded men behind walls barely thicker than paper. The Germans weren't moving. They didn't need to. They had the advantage of height, cover, and a perfect field of fire. Every attempt to reposition drew a burst from the MG42 that sent stone chips spraying like shrapnel. The Americans were stuck. Callahan studied the base of the tower. The gun could only fire outward at distance. Directly beneath its stone platform was a pocket of dead ground, an area the gunner couldn't see. Reaching it meant surviving 200 yards of open field. "No one's making that run," Morris said. Callahan disagreed, but not out of confidence, out of necessity. Men were dying. Every minute they waited, the Germans fortified. If they didn't silence that gun, the advance would stall and casualties would grow. Callahan explained his plan quietly. Morris listened without interrupting. When he finished, Morris rubbed his temples and muttered, "This is either the dumbest thing I've ever heard or the smartest. Hell, maybe both." Callahan nodded. "Probably both." The plan was simple in theory, insane in practice. Crawl. Not run, not sprint. Crawl the entire distance using shell holes, debris, and uneven ground as cover. Slow enough to avoid detection. Steady enough to avoid drawing fire. Unlikely to succeed. Callahan gathered only what he needed. His trench knife, canteen, rope, and a small block and tackle pulley he'd salvaged from a wrecked glider. He left his rifle. It would only slow him down. Morris gave him one last look. "You sure?" Callahan nodded. At 7:18 a.m., Callahan slipped over the wall. The first 50 yards were easy. Irregular ground broken by explosions. He moved inch by inch, elbows and knees sinking into wet earth. The MG42 thundered periodically as it tested arcs across the fields. Dirt sprayed 20 yards to his left as the gunner adjusted fire toward another platoon's position. Callahan froze. He counted the bursts. Short, controlled, efficient. The gunner was trained, disciplined. He swept deliberately, not randomly. It took Callahan 15 minutes to cover the next 30 yards. He found a collapsed wagon and slid beneath it. The wood smelled of mold and rot. A dead horse lay nearby, swollen and stiff. Flies buzzed. He ignored them and studied the next stretch. The ground flattened ahead, dangerous terrain with little cover, but a shallow drainage ditch angled toward the tower, barely 2 feet deep. It was enough. Callahan waited for the next MG42 burst, then slid into the ditch as the gun swept the opposite side. Cold water soaked his uniform. Mud clung to his elbows. He crawled forward, pushing his canteen ahead to reduce noise. Each movement was deliberate. A single splash could give him away. 200 men hung in the balance with every inch he gained. Halfway to the tower, he paused beneath a broken fence line. The tower loomed larger now, massive, immovable. He heard the metallic rattle of the MG42 being reloaded. The distinct sound of a 50-round drum locking into place echoed across the field. Callahan tightened his grip on the rope. His father had once lifted an entire hog carcass using a rope, a beam, and a pulley system after the winch broke. "Everything's heavy until you outsmart it," Tom Callahan had said. The memory steadied him. When the next burst came, Callahan crawled again. A ricochet sparked off a nearby rock, showering him with dust. He didn't flinch. Fear was a luxury. Movement was survival. The dead ground beneath the tower was less than 60 yards away. A crater from an earlier mortar strike marked the final stretch. Callahan slid into it, breathing hard. The MG42 fired again, closer, sharper. The gunner was adjusting angles, searching for new targets. Callahan waited, counting the seconds between bursts. 6 seconds, then 5, then 7. The rhythm told him everything. When the gunner shifted belts, when he scanned sectors, when he paused to cool the barrel. Patterns were opportunities. Patterns were survival. He moved on the 7th second. At 8:02 a.m., Callahan reached the blind spot beneath the tower. The air smelled of powder and damp stone. Above him, the MG42 clattered relentlessly. He pressed his back to the wall. For the first time in an hour, he allowed himself a single breath. The base of the tower was smooth stone. No ladder, no seams, no handholds. But the wooden support beams on the north side were old, weathered, and spaced just wide enough for rope to run between. Callahan studied them the way his father would have. He tied the rope around a protruding beam, slipped the pulley onto the line, and looped the remaining length around his waist. He tested the tension, strong enough, quiet enough if luck held. He whispered a quick prayer, not for safety, but for steadiness. Then he began climbing. Not up the wall, but up the rope, inch by inch, using the pulley to lift his weight with minimal movement. His boots brushed the stone lightly. Every creak made his heart hammer. Above him, the MG42 barked without pause. 20 feet up, the rope burned his palms. Sweat stung his eyes. He kept going. The tower vibrated each time the gunner fired, the recoil shaking the beams. Dust rained down. Callahan clenched his teeth and hauled himself higher. At 30 feet, he reached the underside of the platform. The wooden boards were rough, splintered, and riddled with nail heads. He listened. 2 voices spoke in German, calm, ordinary. One reloaded belts while the other maintained watch. Callahan waited for the chatter to cover his movement, then slid his knife between 2 boards, gently, slowly. He pried upward. Wood groaned. He froze. The voices paused. The MG42 went silent for 2 long, paralyzing seconds. Then the gunner coughed, adjusted his seat, and resumed firing. Callahan continued, pushing a board aside just enough to see into the platform above. Boots, ammo cans. The legs of the MG42 mount. 2 soldiers, one firing, one feeding ammunition. Callahan's heart thumped so loud he feared they'd hear it. He pulled himself level with the opening, gripping the beam with one hand. The rope swayed beneath him. If it slipped, he'd fall 30 feet and break every bone that mattered. The assistant gunner leaned over to grab a new belt. In that moment, Callahan moved. Silent but precise, he slid through the gap like a shadow. His boots touched the platform without a sound. The gunner's back was turned. The other soldier was crouched. The first man never saw him. Callahan clamped a hand over his mouth and pulled him backward, choking off sound while lowering him to the floor. The second turned too late. Callahan struck him across the jaw with the knife handle, dropping him instantly. The MG42 clattered against the railing as it toppled from the gunner's slack grip, nearly falling off the platform. Callahan caught it, eased it down, and pointed it toward the field, away from his men. Silence fell across the tower. Below, the battlefield hesitated. No one understood yet. Then Morris saw the barrel turn and shouted, "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Callahan exhaled, his muscles trembling. He looked down at the 2 unconscious Germans and whispered, "It's done." But it wasn't done, not yet. Callahan heard footsteps pounding up the tower stairs. Heavy, hurried, reinforcements. The Germans had realized the gun had gone silent. He grabbed the MG42 and dragged it behind a crate, pressing himself flat to the boards. The first soldier burst through the hatch, weapon raised. Callahan hooked his boot around the man's ankle and yanked hard. The German slammed face first into the floor. Before he could yell, Callahan drove his shoulder into him, knocking him cold. More boots echoed on the stairs. Too many. Callahan looked at the rope still dangling from the platform. Escape was impossible. Fighting was suicide. He scanned the crates, ammo boxes, spare barrels, sandbags. And then he saw it. A demolition charge. Likely meant to destroy the tower if retreat became necessary. A pound of high explosive wrapped in canvas with a pull fuse. Enough to collapse the platform or seal the stairwell. He grabbed it just as another German climbed through the hatch. Callahan tossed a sandbag at him. The German flinched, ducking instinctively. In that instant, Callahan hurled himself forward, slamming the hatch shut and dropping the heavy crossbar into place. Fists hammered from below, voices shouting in panic. Callahan wedged the charge against the wooden stair frame and pulled the fuse. Sparks hissed. He sprinted across the platform, diving behind a crate as the explosion tore through the tower's interior. Heat and smoke blasted upward in a violent plume. The hatch blew off its hinges. The stairwell collapsed. Screams echoed from below. Dust filled the platform. Callahan coughed, eyes watering. The tower swayed dangerously. "Hold together," he muttered. If the structure fell, so would he. When the dust settled, he crawled to the edge and waved a cloth toward the American lines. Morris saw it and shouted, "The tower's clear! Move up!" Riflemen advanced cautiously, expecting traps. But none came. The German line had fractured. Callahan secured the unconscious Germans, removed bolts from the MG42 to disable it permanently, and waited. His arms felt like rubber, his legs shook. The adrenaline that had carried him finally drained away, leaving exhaustion in its place. Morris reached the tower first. "You absolute maniac," he said, staring at the carnage. "You did it." Callahan managed a tired smile. "Told you it was both." Morris helped him to his feet. Together they climbed down the ruined stairwell. Outside, medics stabilized the 2 stunned Germans. Engineers began inspecting the tower to ensure it wouldn't collapse on the advancing troops. The rest of the company pushed forward, finally free of the killing zone that had trapped them for hours. A group of infantrymen stared at Callahan with wide eyes. One whispered, "He climbed the damn tower." Another replied, "With a rope?" The story began spreading before he could correct it, or before he cared to. Let them exaggerate, he was too tired. By noon, the village was secured. French civilians emerged cautiously from cellars. An elderly woman handed Callahan a cup of water and kissed his cheek. He didn't understand her words, but he understood gratitude. It hit harder than any medal. Morris filed a report detailing Callahan's actions. Command read it twice, then a third time. "He climbed what?" one colonel asked. "Alone?" The response was simple. Sometimes war is won by artillery, sometimes by armor, and sometimes by one stubborn man. 2 weeks later, Callahan received the Distinguished Service Cross. He accepted it quietly, hands folded behind his back, thinking not of glory but of his father saying, "Everything's heavy until you outsmart it." And Callahan had 1 inch at a time,